All right. So we start out the show with Roger Waters singing Pigs on the Wing, uh, part one, and live. And I put that on for my guest today, C.J. Hopkins, who's a playwright and author and a political satirist and proprietor of the Consent Factory, manufacturing consent for private and public sector clients for over 200 years. Uh, Hopkins was recently tried by the German government on charges of having committed a hate crime, i.e., using his book cover art in tweets criticizing the government's mask mandates. The German authorities have also censored his tweets on X and had Amazon ban his book in Germany and the Netherlands. He was found innocent, but the prosecution has appealed his acquittal. His legal fate remains in question. And so today's show will be focused on the case and framing its impact on global free speech. Welcome to the show, CJ.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, Hugo. Good to see you.
You got it. And yeah, I mentioned I put on that song comes from the album Animals, which is, Orwellian based, right, on Animal Farm. Orwell's take on I guess the Soviet Union at the time. And I put it on. Of course, you're always referring to Orwell. Orwell is one of your go-to folks, right? As far as and my favorite book is, of course, 1984, and not just Orwell, but period. And we've talked about that as well. But I want to just devote the show. You've been our guest before. Come on and talk. And by the way, I mentioned the book in question is right here. So The Rise of the New Normal Reich. And if I tip it the right way, I think people can see right here, case in point, that got you got the attention of the German government, which is a swastika slightly put onto this face mask. But I want to turn it over to you and why don't you frame what happened to you and what some of the issues are that where you found yourself defending your free speech rights in front of the German court.
Well, sure. I'll tell you the whole story. I mean, you pretty much covered it in a nutshell in your opening. But yeah, I can go through it in detail. So, go back to the middle of 2022. So I forget where things were at in the States at that point, but everything was still pretty totalitarian here. The unvaccinated were segregated from society, and mask mandates were in effect everywhere, and so it was still pretty intense. I published the book that you just held up in May of 2022 and started promoting it, and it took off. It was a bestseller at Barnes & Noble and Amazon in the beginning, which surprised me, but that was great. In August, there was a lot of discussion in Germany about should we end the mask mandates. I think they were already over in the States at that point. Am I right?
It's hard to figure it out. I could base it a little bit on how long I've been back teaching face to face, and even that isn't a good indicator, because here we were doing face to face, and we were at one point the masks were mandatory, and then at some point they became optional, and now of course only a fraction of the folks are actually wearing them. So I can't quite remember.
Whatever the situation was, it was still, they were still, in full effect here in Germany. And, I think most of your audience is American, so they may not understand it. I mean, Austria had just passed, mandatory vaccination requirements for the entire general population. Germany was on the verge of doing this. They tried to get it through the Bundestag, through the parliament. So things were really still pretty intense. And anyway, people started having a debate about, is it time to end the mask mandates? And I put out two tweets. And the first tweet I wrote them in German, but in English it would basically be, I wrote, the masks are just ideological conformity symbols. That's all they are. That's all they've ever been. Got what else the rest of it was, but that was basically it. And I stuck the cover art of the book on there. And then there was a second tweet. Karl Lauterbach, who is the German health minister, he was quoted in an article in a newspaper, Die Welt, and the quote they tweeted his article, and they put the quote on the tweet, and his quote was, "The masks always send out a signal," right? And I saw that, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly my point. Carl, that's what they're for. They're to send out this signal to basically get everybody to conform and follow orders. And so I used his tweet, and I stuck the cover art on there again. And so those two tweets went out late August. I forget the exact dates. And what happened is, a few days later, an organization called the Hessen Cyber Competence Center, the Hessen 3C for short. This organization, which is it's a department of another department of the interior of the Ministry of the Interior of the federal state of Hesse, which is one of the federal states of Germany. It's also a part of the national network of, what do you want to call them? They monitor, hate crime and illegal speech and what have you. So this organization saw the two tweets. They reported them to Twitter and instructed Twitter to censor them. So Twitter censored the tweets. They reported the tweets to basically the German FBI, okay, the Bundeskriminalamt, which is the federal criminal police edifice. And the German FBI reviewed the tweets, and they forwarded them to the Berlin State Prosecutor's Office. And the Berlin State Prosecutor's Office launched a criminal investigation of me based on these two tweets, right? This investigation went on for, 8 months or something. And at the end of it, I got a notice that I had been charged and I was facing criminal charges for these two tweets, and that I had already been found guilty, basically, and I had been fined 3,600 euro or 60 days in jail. Right? I'll come back to that in a minute. The third thing that happened, and I can't prove this because I don't have evidence yet, but basically the same day that all this other stuff happened, someone contacted Amazon, and Amazon banned my book in Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria. All of this happened within 2 days. I don't have proof yet that it was the German authorities that instructed Amazon to ban the book, so I can't make that claim, but it would be kind of a crazy coincidence if that's not what happened. Anyway, I went out and got a lawyer. We're up to June of 2023 now. I went out and got a lawyer after I got this order of punishment, is literally what it's called. So we said, no, we want to go to court. I'm not going to pay the fine. We want to go ahead and have a trial. And that went on, and there were various briefs exchanged. And long story short, I went to trial in criminal court. And I'll just remind everybody, this is for 2 tweets, okay? So on January 23rd, I went to trial in criminal court for my 2 tweets. And I was acquitted, of course, because the German law is very clear, and I obeyed the law. I didn't break the law. And so I thought that was it. I figured, after the trial and after my acquittal, because, frankly, it was really embarrassing for the prosecutor. They had no case whatsoever. And there was never any question of them having a case. I think the idea was to bully me and make an example of me, and just figuring, hey, this guy will just pay the fine and go away. He's not going to pay, a lawyer 3 times the amount of the fine to go to trial. But I did. And I was acquitted, and I figured it was all over. And no, a week later, we find out that the prosecutor is appealing my acquittal. And so now I'm facing a second criminal trial, this time in appeals court. And we don't have a date yet. It'll probably be late summer, early autumn. So that's the whole Kafkaesque story, basically.
And what's fun about it too is that, the names of these, this group, the Hessen group, and I guess you said they had no case, but what what exactly was the crime they were accusing you of having done? Did it have to deal with the swastika on the mask, or what was the issue?
Yeah, that was the pretext for it. I've said from the beginning uh, that this is blatantly part of uh, just the much larger, and maybe we can talk about that when we're done talking about my case. Just the broader crackdown on dissent and criminalization of political dissent that is going on, not just in Germany, it's going on all over the world. There's a new piece, remind me, we could talk about it later, put out by Trish Wood, who's a great Canadian journalist, about the new legislation that's being passed in Canada. There's legislation like this is being rolled out in the UK, in Australia, I believe. So, Germany is not an exception here. Um, it's pretty clear that they basically wanted to punish me and make an example of me, and the pretext was the swastika that is hidden behind the mask in my cover art, which I used in the tweets. And so they charged me with disseminating, I forget the exact wording, it's basically disseminating pro-Nazi propaganda. Which of course is absurd. If anyone knows anything about my work or just looks at the book cover or the tweets, it's clear that I'm not promoting Nazism with it. But they could charge me with that because in Germany, displaying swastikas in order to promote Nazism is of course banned, which I think is a good thing. I don't want Nazis running around waving swastikas and Nazi symbols. The law, however, is really clear. Of course, there have to be exceptions to this blanket ban. They can't just ban all displays of swastikas. You couldn't see a Quentin Tarantino movie or read, William Shirer's History of the Third Reich or any of these things. Swastikas are displayed all the time. And there are specific exceptions that are written into the law. Two of those exceptions, the ones that apply to me, are first of all for art, and second of all for people who are trying to avert anti-constitutional activity, sort of countering, using swastikas to warn about, hey, there's this, fascist stuff happening over here. There's this totalitarian stuff coming down the pipe, and you're allowed to use swastikas when you're doing that. The other exceptions are, for education and history and a few other things. All of these exceptions are clearly written into the law, which I think a lot of Americans don't understand. They just think swastikas are banned, per se in Germany, and so that's what I mean when I say they didn't have a case. Obviously the prosecutors, I don't know how bright they are, but they're smart enough to have read the law and understood the law. The charges, in my opinion, they were brought just simply as punishment and to make an example of me.
So, yeah, I mean that's what I want to kind of go back to that. What do you why come down on you? For example, the Hessen folks bring it to the attention of the German FBI, and why is the FBI, recommending to the prosecution to take you to trial. I mean, what's the, do you know what do you think is going on in the background there with all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's not in the background. It's right out. It's right out in the foreground. Yeah, the crackdown on anybody expressing dissent against the whole official COVID pandemic narrative and all of the authoritarian, totalitarian measures that were brought out. Anyone who was expressing dissent, and I was very loudly expressing dissent, was cracked down on. I don't know if you remember or if you were aware of them. There was a really huge protest here in Berlin right at the beginning in August of 2020. And Bobby Kennedy came and spoke at it. It was massive, and it was right, in the center of Berlin. The main organizer of that was a guy named Michel Ballweg, right? They arrested Michel on false charges. They put him in prison for 10 months, okay? Confiscated his assets. Yeah, he was a successful businessman before he organized this protest. After 10 months, they let him out of prison, and the judge said, no, there's no case here. Yeah. And so they let him out of prison. They kept part of his assets. They gave some back to him. And just to make my point, a couple of weeks ago, he announced a new protest, just a free speech protest for August of this year. So the German authorities have now seized another 250,000 euros of his assets. This is just one example, Hugo. There are countless examples of prominent people who spoke out against the so-called COVID measures, who were hit with false charges and brought on trial. And if you had watched the media here, for example, and I know it happened in the States too because I've covered it. It's in the book. Just the demonization of anyone who was expressing dissent or questioning the official narrative was absolutely intense. So it's really no mystery as to why they came after me.
Okay, so when you finally got the charges or whatever, the decision, should I say, you were already found guilty, and they were asked, what was the thinking behind it, rather than just paying the fine and moving on to taking this thing to court and end up, incurring 3 times the cost in order to defend yourself? What were you thinking there?
I just think you don't give. You don't do that. You don't give in to this. You don't give in to bullies. You don't give in to these types of authoritarian tactics. There are so many people here who have faced and are facing the same type of charges, and most of those people, don't have any kind of a platform. And I'm not world famous, but I've got a little bit of an audience, a little bit of a platform. And I just felt like, hey, it's my responsibility to walk this through and demonstrate what's happening. Put it in people's faces and say, look at what's happening. Look at what the authorities are doing. Look how they're cracking down on dissent.
Right.
Sadly, and I do like to mention this, I think part of the reason that I was acquitted in the end, I want to give the judge credit. I think she understands the law and she wanted to respect the law. At the same time, I had articles written about this case in the big Swiss paper, in the Atlantic, in the States, from Matt Taibbi, who's big independently. So, and lots of other smaller outlets. So there was a lot of press attention to this. And when we went into the trial, there were over 50 people there. The gallery was packed. They had to move us into a big room. So there was a lot of attention to the case. And that was exactly my intent. I wanted to draw attention to what the authorities are doing.
Yeah, well, I'll just say also, you knew that you had your case. You had read the law. You knew they didn't have a case based on the law itself. But I will say, for someone who who follows you, and of course I've known you for 45 years, but for even for folks who followed you on the Consent Factory, as far as your blog post and on Substack and all the various ways you get the word out. I remember when you sent the last supplement before you were going to trial. Uh, it was a little bit frightening because you didn't know what was going to happen when you went in there,
Well,
and even made remarks as to the fact if you want to come visit me, bring a carton of cigarettes.
sure.
I was and it was and you had invited everybody there. I remember I spoke to my wife and I said, what would happen if I got a round trip ticket to Berlin for Chris's trial? I couldn't afford it, but at the time, but I was on the thing. But let's just say that as someone who was watching on the sidelines, I was frightened for you and didn't know what
Well,
was going to happen.
I still don't know what's going to happen, Hugo. I mean, it's completely possible that I'll go to the appeals court and get a different judge who doesn't respect the law, more
Right.
than he or she is invested in the ideology, and they'll overturn my acquittal. This could happen. I wanted to give my first judge a little bit of credit. I mean, she obviously despised me, and after she pronounced my acquittal, which happened right there at the trial, she said, the whole thing took about 90 minutes. That's the way it works in the German system. And at the end, she said, okay, this guy is acquitted. And then she launched into a long tirade and called me all sorts of names. And then when she was finished insulting me, then she put on her COVID mask and stalked out of the courtroom, to make a big statement. So if this case goes to the appeals court, if the prosecutor, keeps the appeal going, I could get another judge. The way things are these days, I don't just because I actually have the law on my side doesn't mean that they're going to follow the law.
Right. And so let's say if they lost the acquittal, or if they lost the case the second time, is there another court that they can take it to, another appeals court, if they lose this appeal? I mean, because you'd suggested in your article that your expectation is they're going to hound you until crack of doom on this case, right?
I don't know. I think theoretically, sure, because there's another level, which is basically the German Supreme Court.
Right.
I haven't thought about it that much because, frankly, I was flabbergasted that they filed this appeal.
Right.
Because again, they have absolutely no case, and the prosecutor kind of embarrassed himself during the trial. But I think theoretically, yeah, they could go one more level up. And I certainly will if they overturn my acquittal.
Right.
In the appeals court, I'll appeal that and take it up to the highest court.
I guess I don't want you to show your hand, but I guess the question would become for me is that, if you were to lose the case, right? I mean, obviously you would immediately appeal, and I don't know if that would keep you keep them from incarcerating you. But if it came between incarceration and paying the fine, have you thought about that at all?
Oh yeah, sure. If it comes down to it, and it's a choice between, give us some money or we're going to put you in jail, I'll give them some money.
All right, because
I'm going to be 63 years old this year.
Exactly.
I don't relish the idea of going to German prison.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything, but again, when you go to trial, this order of punishment is gone. It's thrown out the window. Like at this trial that I just had.
Right.
If the judge had found me guilty, she could have imposed whatever sentence she wanted to impose.
I see.
I think the statute, it has a certain limit of how much you can be fined, and I think they can put you in prison for up to 3 years.
Right. I mean, again, going back to that article before you went in, it was reminding me of Socrates in I forget whatever episode that was by Plato, where he's drinks the hemlock to prove what he was a good Athenian. He followed the letter of the law rather than letting his friends sneak him out, or pay the fine, whatever it was. Uh, so it's you. I know you were a philosophy minor, and so it's always fascinating. Our students to keep it, to make it part of the college too. We read these things, we teach these things, and it becomes much more interesting when in life you find yourself actually you're in the situation now. And so I just want to say that was I was thinking a lot about that you're I knew you were doing it for again, you as a satirist, right? This is how you make your living, is by speaking your truth in in your own way, and to allow the authorities to let you to silence you. It you know it begs the question, what why maybe you're in the wrong business. I will say, and I don't want to tie it too much, but to we haven't talked too much about this idea of the swastika and all the all the thinking around it. But there's a recent book that came out called The Holocaust: An Unfinished Story. It was in the New York Times book review, and I read it. And one of the things that the person who wrote the book is actually, I think he's in a Holocaust Institute in England, who wrote the book, but talking about how in there are countries now that, for example, the Poland has passed a law where it's basically illegal to insult the Polish state, in particular to write about, remind them, or talk about the behavior of Poles during World War II and the invasion of both the Soviets but also the Nazis, and basically their complicity in the Holocaust. And I know that, like in the case of Germany, many times, I'm not going to say they're posing, but they feel this need to virulently show their anti-Naziness as a way to answer for the past. And so again, because I think there's some folks, when we were putting this show together, that what I'm saying, I'm sitting here, I'm going to do a show about a guy who put a swastika on his book cover, and but is defending himself. Some people would not. I don't know if they could understand, if they could unpack all of that and understand what's really at stake here. So, I mean, I don't know how you feel about any of that.
Yeah, there are a couple of good points there. Do we have time before we go to your break, or?
No, let's do the break now, and I'll let you answer it in the second half of the show. So it's 1:29. The show is What's Going On. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez, here on LaGuardia Web Radio. And my guest today is C.J. Hopkins, who is a playwright and author. He's a political satirist and proprietor of the Consent Factory, manufacturing consent for private and public sector clients for over 250 years. Hopkins was recently tried by the German government on charges of having committed a hate crime, i.e. using his book cover art in tweets criticizing the government's mask mandates. The German authorities have also censored his tweets on X, and at Amazon banned his book in Germany and the Netherlands, also Austria. He was found innocent, but the prosecution has appealed his acquittal. His legal fate remains in question. And this show we're focusing on the case and framing it as far as its impact on global free speech. And again, that legislation by the Polish government is certainly an infringement of free speech, certainly within Poland. Here's the book cover again, and I'll try to tip it, I don't know, so folks can see the swastika in the center of the mask. So yeah, you wanted to respond to some of those remarks I made?
Yeah, the first thing that I want to point out is, and this is not, it's not to criticize you or to get you or anything like this, because it happens, I think most Americans do this. They say, you put a swastika on the cover, what are you saying about the Holocaust? And
I didn't say that. I'm just saying that people think that. I was trying to empathize with the audience in a sense.
It's fine. I wasn't, but I'm really not trying to get you. What I'm trying to point out is that people see the book cover, they see the swastika, and they think Holocaust. right?
Right.
It actually has nothing to do with the Holocaust. Right? What it has to do with, and I made a long sort of aggressive statement in court, reminding the court this. What I did, I didn't compare anything to the Holocaust. I compared the the abrogation of the Constitution and all of the authoritarian measures that were rolled out and the behavior of the authorities and the police and the media during 2020, 2021, part of 2022. I compared all of that to the rise of Nazi Germany, right? The entire history of Nazi Germany is not the Holocaust. The Holocaust was, the most horrible thing, the most memorable thing that Nazi Germany did. But the history of Nazi Germany and the history of the rise of Nazi Germany does not reduce to the Holocaust. And satirists or analysts or historians need to be able to look at the world and point at things and say, wow, this thing that's developing here, I'm going to compare this to the early evolution and the rise of, Nazism in Germany. And we need to be able to make those comparisons. I've made those comparisons throughout that book, and I cited examples of them over and over again. The classic, I think the biggest example was the Infektionsschutzgesetz, the Infection Protection Act that was passed, or actually it was revised in the autumn of 2020 in Germany. And this act, this legislation, granted the German government the power to ignore the Constitution, to abrogate constitutional rights, and to rule by decree because of a state of emergency. This is exactly how the Nazis came into power. Their bill was called the Enabling Act. It was the Enabling Act of 1933. Hitler didn't come and take over the government by force. He did it legally, step by step. And once he got into office, they passed this Enabling Act that declared a state of emergency in Germany. So therefore, the government needed the power to abrogate the Constitution and rule by decree. This is just one example of what I covered in the book. Nowhere in the book am I comparing anything to the Holocaust. I'm comparing the development of one system of power to the development of the best historical example of totalitarianism that we have. I think it's because of how emotional and how hysterical everything got that people can't see that rather simple point. I mean, if you think about it, if we're not allowed to analyze anything and compare anything to Nazi Germany anymore, how crazy is that? The other point that I will make is I just found it bizarre, and I laugh because, think back to the Trump years. How often there's a classic cover from Der Stern magazine here of Trump wrapped in an American flag giving a Hitler salute. How often was Trump compared to Hitler over and over again? There's a classic video that was produced by the New York Times, for God's sake. I think it was Jason Stanley, he's a Yale professor, going on and on and on about how Trump is just like Hitler over and over. And you can go back to the 90s. It was basically de rigueur to compare George Bush the first, to Hitler when the first invasion of Iraq was rolled out, in leftist circles. And then again, after the invasion of Iraq went bad, George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq went bad. Then again, it's Bush's Hitler, Bush's Hitler. And what I'm trying to say is people have been comparing people and developments to the Nazis and to Hitler forever. And suddenly, crazy Hopkins, sticks a swastika underneath a medical mask on his book, and it's a federal case.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't trying to I wasn't trying to say you were doing that at all. I was just referring to that text because that's where I found out about the Polish legislation. And maybe we should talk some more about, because as you said, or as I've said, we talked about in your description, and what we
Can I
said we do in
can I
this
just
show
can I
is
just
just,
interrupt you for a second,
oh
Hugo?
yeah, sure, go
Because
right ahead.
I'm glad you brought it up, and I didn't think you were trying to get. I'm the guy that wrote the piece for the Atlantic, Jamie Kirchick. When he was interviewing me, one of the questions he asked me is, what do you say to people who are really offended, by this cover, by you putting the swastika on the cover?
Right.
And I said to Jamie, I said, absolutely, I understand that. This is what I do. I'm a satirist. I'm provocative. If people are offended by this, then I understand that, and I take that criticism. I do what I do knowing that it's going to offend a lot of people. That isn't the point. The point is, are we at a point now where we're censoring everything that is going to offend some people? I mentioned before the legislation that's rolling out in Canada, and I just read this piece today by Trish Wood. I encourage people to look it up. She publishes on her Substack now. She used to be a big Canadian journalist years ago and a documentary filmmaker. And Trish wrote about the new legislation that's being rolled out, which basically allows the Canadian government, if someone files a complaint, and let's say you, for example, if we were Canadians, and if I file a complaint with the Canadian government and I say, I think that Hugo is going to publish some hate speech, just based on what I've heard from Hugo and my impression of Hugo, is I feel threatened by this guy. I feel like he's gonna publish some hate speech. This legislation now allows the Canadian government
Start off over with the Canadian law. Yeah, Chris. So go ahead. You wanted to talk about that particular case in Canada.
Yeah, I was just, we had a little bump, so yeah, I'll say it again. I was just reminding you and people that were listening. I mentioned it before. Trish Wood, who's a great Canadian journalist, was just writing about this new legislation that's being rolled out in Canada, where if somebody suspects that someone might publish some hate speech in the future, they can file a complaint or a notice with the Canadian government, and then the Canadian government can impose all sorts of restrictions on this person who is suspected of future thought crime, up to making them wear an ankle bracelet and restricting where they can speak, and just really authoritarian, really totalitarian stuff. And I get the sense that most people are not aware of all of these measures that are being rolled out in this legislation that is being rolled out. So,
do you know who's behind? Oh, excuse me. Do you know who's behind the legislation in Canada? Like, who started this?
I don't know. I don't have the details on that at all. To me, it's I don't know. I guess the question doesn't, the specific individuals that got it rolling are not so important to me, because this is happening in countries throughout the West. This is obviously a systemic development.
Right.
It's not just two or three crazy people in Parliament somewhere. This is happening and has been happening in the UK. It's happening in here in continental Europe. It's happening in Canada. It's happening in Australia.
And I just again, because it's when you hear something like that, and let's say you have a particular political leaning, you always seem to think it's the other side that came up with it. And but I mean, when you talked about that, I just think about with First Amendment law here in the United States and the notion of prior restraint. Though here it's that law sounds like prior restraining order. So in my seat, I would think, oh, that's coming from the right. But we are certainly globally, I think that we're experiencing, basically when people disagree. I mean, is it Antifa who believes that the extreme right shouldn't even be given the platform to share their ideas or speak. Uh, Anybody who's going to be talking about uh, fascism, they're not, we can't even allow them to get the ideas out there, which is a concern. I know you recently did a show with Fire, the folks who you see as like the new ACLU, uh, but I've heard reports of concern that since when you defend everybody, then your chances of pissing off everyone are as high. So, so if you see this as a global pattern, uh, you know, what's the response? What's the response to be? Go to court like you? Well, for example, here, in Poland they've passed this legislation, and you're going through this in Germany. Here in Canada, they're passing their laws. I know that that Trump is not necessarily seen at you don't see Trump as the new Hitler, but he's got a lot of plans when he takes office, or at least we're told of things that he's going to pass. So what do we do? By the way, we've lost your video for some reason, and it's not streaming. Oh, there you go. Now you're streaming. So what is our response to be?
Well, I just mentioned one thing before we get into the responses. There's one big case going on in the United States right now where a bunch of parties, and I forget which state it is, Missouri, it was suing the federal government. It's the Biden administration, basically, for collaborating with the big tech corporations to censor everybody. I don't know if you watched any of the hearings, that Matt Taibbi was at. It's the Republicans are holding the hearings, and of course, they're using it for their own partisan purposes. But nonetheless, it's just a monumental story that isn't being covered, of course. Forget about Germany for a second. This is the United States. This is, the United States government, contacting global corporations like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and what have you, contacting them and saying, censor these people, visibility this guy, visibility filter this guy, suppress this speech. It's basically the government working with corporations to do what the government is forbidden by the United States Constitution from doing, which is censoring people, right? So it's also happening in the U.S. I think the response to it, you mentioned the partisan thing, Hugo, and I think that the partisan thing is making people completely blind. Most people who don't know me and just hear about me now, they think, oh yeah, CJ, right, he's a far right conservative, whatever. And I'm an old lefty. I'm an old ACLU lefty type, right? But these days, and you mentioned Antifa as well, I'm sorry, I just have to bring this up. There's a great documentary that was made by another lefty here in Germany, in Berlin, Aya Velasquez, about the COVID years and so on. And in there's a clip of Antifa, gathered together, as in their Antifa mob, and they're all shouting, "We will vaccinate you! We will vaccinate you!" Antifa during 2020, 2021 here in Germany, Antifa were basically the brown shirts. Anytime anyone went out and held up the German Constitution and said, could we please have our constitutional rights? You guys do what you want, but could we please obey the German Constitution? Antifa descended on them and, tried to attack them and start fights. The partisan thing, I think, is blinding a lot of people. We were talking about Canada, and if your question was, did this impetus to censor everybody and do this Minority Report stuff, did this come from the right or from the left? The answer is it came from the left. But what does the left mean anymore? To me, that's not the left. This type of authoritarianism is not what I understand, as the left, but it is what is identified as the left and what is called the left. and people are put in a double bind these days, where if someone is liberal, if someone is left leaning, they're put in this place where, oh, I have to support all of this authoritarian censorship stuff and all of this criminalization of, I have to support this, because if I don't, then I'm over here in the right wing camp, right? And that's how twisted it is. What is the response to it all? My response to it is, no, you don't have to support it. You can still have your liberal values, you can have your leftist values, and you can still speak out against this, this authoritarianism, totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it. I mean, the Canadian stuff it's minority report level stuff. They're going to deal with people for possible future thought crimes.
Right. When you talked about that, it reminds me. There's I'm Cuban American, and there's a Cuban saying that one of my professors once taught me, because he had, he lived through. He was old enough to remember the Cuban Revolution, but he lived in Cuba during, the early Fidel period, then got out and was here. And he used to basically say, "Same dog, different collar." But one of the things I wanted to talk about, and it takes us off of this, but it ties in the sense is, again, thinking about the left or the nuances of the left is now with what's going on in Gaza and how it's kind of created a chill, certainly in academics, about folks taking a side on that situation. And again, it's creating prior restraint on the part of folks because they're concerned if they take one side or the other that they're canceled. Cancel culture is a piece of this as well, and it's kind of sad that I mean, we're taught this. I was brought up with on TV and in the movies, and in your history class about this rugged American individualism, Oxbow incident, and all of this stuff. But what typically we seem to find in these times when there are extreme crises like the COVID situation now, what's going on with the Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza, is folks learning the hard lesson of conformity. That they have to find that they have to conform if they want to get by. And I think that's another piece of the global, we're seeing it happen as nations take side, the global free speech issues, right?
Yeah, well, you held up my book, and the title of the book is The Rise of the New Normal Reich. Obviously, I took it. I was copying William Shirer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. The New Normal Reich. That doesn't refer to Germany. That refers to the global power system that we all live under, and it's global. I go on, write a bit about it in the book, trying to explicate a lot of that. The short version, of the message is that this global power system that we live under and that we have been living under for a little over 30 years now, since the end of the Cold War, that system is evolving in a very authoritarian and I argue a nascent totalitarian way. And it is doing that because it really doesn't have anything left to do. It already controls the entire globe. It controls the planet. Yes, there's competition between nation states, just like there's competition between corporations. But the system itself envelops the entire planet. It doesn't have anything else to do other than crack down and try to eliminate internal dissent and create ideological uniformity. You were just talking about conformity. And that's what I see everywhere, is this pressure to conform to whatever the official narrative of the day is. You mentioned Gaza, and I just want to make one point, because it's not just in the States. It has been very interesting and weird and sad to watch here. because so many of the pro-Palestinian folks, the folks that are criticizing Israel and coming out for the Palestinians, so many of these folks are now experiencing the full force of the German censorship machine, of the German criminalization of dissent machine. I mean, the cops are, beating up protesters, stomping on their votive candles. People are, being arrested for saying the wrong things. Artists are absolutely being canceled left and right. Anybody who expresses, any type of support for the Palestinians. There was a huge brouhaha recently at the Berlinale Film Festival because a team of one Israeli and one Palestinian filmmaker, they won a big award for their documentary. Got up, made a speech. One of them said the words genocide. And it was, just the whole German culture went absolutely nuts for days. And one of the German officials that was there who had clapped during the speech had to come out and make a statement that I was only clapping for the Israeli. I was not clapping for the Palestinian. This is how insane all of this is. The thing that is sad and bizarre is that so many of the pro-Palestinian activists here are now experiencing the full force of the system that they helped bring into being during 2020 and 2021. So many of these people are the same people who were demonizing people like me, demonizing anyone who was asking questions, anyone who was questioning the narrative, anyone who was expressing dissent. These people were demonizing us and calling for us to be put in camps and locked in our houses and censored and shut out of the culture. And now they're experiencing the force of the machine that they helped to create.
Yeah, it's a little reminiscent of Stalin and the purges, what happened there as well. So but we're starting to run out of time. I want to save a little bit for a little bit of music, but I also want to give you an opportunity. We've got about 6 minutes. So I want to give you about 3 of those. Any last things you want to share before we're done here?
No, if you've got another question for me, I'll give it a go, but I don't have anything that I really want to.
Well, I think we should, again, we should talk about what's fascinating about you is that in this book you wrote your dystopian fiction of what you thought was, I don't know if you thought that was what was going to happen, but you certainly wrote about it, and you've talked about it in your blog that some people saw it as like some sort of like playbook or roadmap on how to behave for the totalitarians that have taken over our culture and the planet. And of course, this one is kind of documenting your own watching as the entire COVID epidemic unfolded until it got to the point that you weren't what you. I think you told a story about being chased around some deli because you didn't have a mask on, getting run out of there. Or no, you were wearing a bag over your head. So
That was at the very.
You cover both ends of the spectrum here of what's coming out.
That was at the very. That was a holiday time in 2020. It's before I realized how serious everything was going to get. Yeah, and I made myself a mask out of a paper bag, and yeah, they sent 3 heavily armed, body armored German police to pull me out of the store. I'm glad you mentioned, Zone 23. I mean, it's not exactly a prediction of what happened or anything, but the major, the reason I have jokingly apologized for writing that book, I usually say, I didn't know they were going to use it as a blueprint, folks. The reason I jokingly apologize, the major theme of that is kind of what I've seen unfolding over the past few years. I talk about totalitarianism a lot. And people hear that and they think, what? Where are the jackboots? I don't see any, Nazis running around with banners. Of course not. It's not 20th century totalitarianism. One of the main themes of Zone 23 is the pathologization of power, the pathologization of politics. And that's kind of what I'm tracking now and what I've been tracking for the last few years. In other words, the dissent that I keep talking about, that I've been engaging in and being punished for, is political dissent, folks. It's political, but it isn't framed as political in our culture anymore, right? I'm no longer a political dissident, right? I'm a conspiracy theorist, right? I'm a COVID denier, which sounds like I'm a blasphemer or something. I deny, COVID, and you know, we're hit with all these pathologized terms which erase the political conflict, right? So maybe that is the one thing that I wanted to say. I'd like folks to just pay attention to how politics and political conflict is being erased, and it's being replaced with this pathologized discourse. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that because we're almost out of time. So today, the show is What's Going On. I'm your host, Hugo Fernandez, here on LaGuardia Web Radio. And my guest today has been C.J. Hopkins, playwright, author, political satirist, and the proprietor of the Consent Factory, manufacturing consent for private and public sector clients for over 250 years. Hopkins was recently tried by the German government on charges of having committed a hate crime, i.e. using his book cover art in tweets criticizing the government's mask mandates. The German authorities have also censored his tweets on X and had Amazon ban his book in Germany and the Netherlands, as well as Austria. He was found innocent, but the prosecution has appealed his acquittal. His legal fate remains in question. The show will has been focusing today on the case, and we've been framing it as far as how it talks about the impact on global free speech. And we're gonna go out the way we came in with Pink Floyd and Pigs on the Wing. And my engineer behind the scenes, Christopher Pope, who is, takes no responsibility in any of the political discussion that we had here on the show, will take us out. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening.